G'day. Earlier this week, the federal government released its Future Fuels Strategy. Now, this has been a strategy that's been in development for some time, and in fact, the first iteration went back to the Alternative Fuels Conversion Strategy in 2011. ACAPMA, together with AIP and the Hydrogen and Biofuels Lobby, have been participants in that process. But it's probably worthwhile taking a few moments to just reflect on what's actually been announced today and what it means from the perspective of fuel retailers, particularly given some of the questions I've had to field this week from our own members. The first thing to actually note is that the government's actually announced a strategy where the strategy is premised in one simple maxim or one simple principle, and that is it is the consumer's right to determine which car, which technology they actually purchase. And so from that perspective, much to the chagrin or the disappointment of the electric vehicles lobby and the vehicle manufacturers, the government is not going to use taxpayer funds to bridge the premium between what I pay for an electric vehicle versus what I pay for an equivalent conventional fueled vehicle, which at the moment that premium's somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. But what the government has done in this strategy is to direct its resources, its funding and its policy at the areas that are actually creating barriers to the uptake of this technology in the industry. And that's actually a good thing. So there's really two areas. The first of those is actually to assist in creating a catalyst for the rollout of EV charging. And within that context, they've announced funding for 50,000 home-based chargers and are expanding the Future Fuels Fund to actually support the rollout of fast charge infrastructure. And readers of ACAPMA will be very familiar with the fact that ACAPMA has been working with a number of our leading edge retailers in playing in that space as well. But I think it's worthwhile just to look at some perspective in terms of some of the incredible claims that have been made about the strategy and criticism of the strategy in the past week. The first thing to note here is the government strategy to roll out 50,000 home chargers will effectively support somewhere between 55 and 60,000 vehicles in a 20 million strong vehicle fleet in this country. So you start to get a bit of an idea of some of the perspective that's actually there. The goal that's actually been set in terms of some of the modelling that says we'll get to about 1.7 million passenger cars that'll be EV or plug-in hybrid electric vehicle by 2030 represents about 11% of the just under 15 million passenger cars that operate in the country. So 1 in 10. So when you listen to people like the head of Tritium and others that are sort of saying, well, service stations really now have a Kodak moment in front of them, that's clearly not the case. We're talking about a shift. There's no doubt about that. And we are on the start of a trajectory that will actually see electric vehicles take hold in the market. But I suppose to categorise a well-worn shampoo ad, it's certainly not going to happen overnight. And it's something that in our industry, we need to be cognizant of. We need to watch this agenda, and we actually need to make sure that our investment is timed to deal with the demands that might come as more and more of these vehicles appear in the fleet. But it's also important that we don't invest ahead of the demand. Now, the second strategy that was actually announced by the government was to address the issue of grid readiness. And there's been a lot of conversation about the fact that unlike places like Norway, that people celebrate as being one of the big champions or the poster children of EV take-up, a lot of people lose sight of the fact that the reason that happened in that country was because they had public-owned generation companies, government-owned generation companies, that effectively had spare demand because they had this massive rollout of renewables. And they were looking at where they might actually direct the surplus electricity generation they actually had. And so they embarked on a 12-year time frame to actually move down the path of promoting a lot of EVs, and there were very strong incentives that were actually provided. But there really is a question about whether that sort of strategy in a country that has surplus demand and state-owned assets is relevant to a country like Australia, where we don't have surplus demand. We have significant challenges in terms of our grid, and we've got a mix between private and public ownership of energy generation companies. So within that context, it's a case of making sure that we don't just port a strategy from another country and drop it in on the Australian market, not recognising that the fundamentals of that market are actually quite different. So look, within that context, I suppose the key point or the key message that actually comes out of this is, the world is shifting and we as fuel retailers need to move with it. The concept of accommodating an alternative fuel alongside conventional fuel is not new to us. We've been dealing with LPG since the late 70s, and that's a strategy that we've seen and gone. But to those that say to me, are we just looking at another flash in the pan? I suppose it's worthwhile noting that this is the third time in the last 40 years that we've actually seen government globally and in Australia start to move to try and promote EVs and hydrogen-powered vehicles. So they go to the 1986 work with EV1 and General Motors Holden's first EV in California. We started to see another ramp up with a generation of new mass market EVs in a very limited scale in the early noughties. And there was some work done here by Australian governments to promote adoption in their corporate fleets, but that subsided. And we're now sitting at the third attempt to get the market going. Those that suggest that, this just might be another case of a bit of a flash in the pan, I don't think that's the case. I think we're really at a point here where third time we're getting it right. The strategy that the government has actually got is a reasonable one. It recognises the market constraints, but it also says that the choice of the vehicle technology purchased by a household and a consumer is their choice, not one that should be foisted by government, and nor should government be using taxpayer funds to fund a premium product over a technology product at the moment that is finding it difficult to compete given the high capital cost and the range concerns. But within our context, I think for us it actually means we need to continue to be part of the conversation. We need to keep an eye on this. The fleet will shift. At the moment, the total number of EVs as a proportion of the fleet that is registered on the road today is 0.135 of 1%. Under this strategy, it will actually grow to close to 11% of passenger vehicles, and that's something we have to pay attention to. So not a Kodak moment, but certainly something we need to keep an eye on.